Hi everyone, I'm Kennan, and in today's video, we're going to be getting nerdy about Porsches, but we're not going to be talking about the brand's history or their famed engineering or what these cars are like to drive. Instead, we're going to be discussing the famed DME reports. That's right, the Over Rev reports. And in today's video, we're going to be discussing the 3 things that you need to know in order to interpret one properly. And with that, let's get started. Before I get going though, no, Doug's Courier GT is not for sale, and I certainly wouldn't be the one to make that announcement, but we do sell hundreds and hundreds of Porsches on Cars and Bids. So after you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to head to carsandbids.com where you can check out the live listing on this Porsche, and this one, and this one, and this one. The first thing you need to know is what a DME actually is and what car you're driving, which sounds very obvious, but we'll get to that in just a second. So what is a DME? A DME is a digital motor electronic system. This is a Bosch engine management system. It's the computer inside the car. Think of it basically as the brain. In other cars, they're called ECUs or electronic control units, and they do exactly the same thing. One of the unique benefits of the Porsche DME is that it can track ignitions that occur within certain RPM ranges. This is beneficial for technicians as they're trying to diagnose a car, they can go back and look at the historical record of when the car has been in these ignition ranges, usually over the red line, and it helps them diagnose issues that might be occurring with the engine. With that out of the way, it's important to know what car you're driving or what car you're assessing, because the RPM ranges that occur for this historical record are different for every car. When I worked at an exotic car dealership in Ohio, I had made a list of cars that would come in with relative frequency, and I actually went down and found each of the ranges that would occur for these ignitions, so that when I would get a DME report, I could look at it and understand exactly what I was looking at. For the Courier GT, for instance, the range 1 ignitions occur between 8,400 RPM and 9,000 RPM. Range 2 is anything over 9,000. This car only has 2 ranges, as a lot of cars from its era did. Later Porsches were able to track up to 6 ignition ranges, which gave mechanics a little bit more insight into how a car was driven. The cars on my list are specific to cars that I saw very often at the exotic car dealership I worked at, but they're not unique to these models. Even Cayennes have this ability. However, it's more applicable to cars like these because these cars have manual transmissions. Automatic transmissions won't allow you to over-rev a car. The computer will step in and not allow you to perform a shift. Whereas a manual, well, you're the one in control. And so it is possible to have a misshift or something like that that increases the revs of the engine over the red line. And so that's why I made this specific list, and this is the list of cars that people check very often when it comes to DME reports. The second thing you need to know with a DME report is how to actually read it, what conclusions you can draw from it. And we're going to be talking about 2 specific examples that have sold on Cars and Bids. We're going to be looking at a 996 generation turbo cabriolet, and we're also going to be looking at a 997.1 GT3. And I've chosen these 2 particular cars for very specific reasons, as they have unique nuances that you would need to know if you're looking at a DME report. That's why it's important to always do your research. And so we start with the 996 turbo. When you get a DME report, you're going to be shown a couple of different things. One is the ranges and the number of ignitions that have occurred in each of them. You're also going to have a timestamp on when that last ignition occurred. This is really important as it gives you a historical reference point for when this issue occurred with this car. And then you're also going to have the total number of operating hours for that engine. This is really important to reference because when you look at when the last engine ignition occurred in one of these ranges, you can compare it to the total number of hours, and that will give you the amount of time that has elapsed since that ignition occurred. In the case of the 996 turbo, it only has 2 ignition ranges. Ignitions that occur between 6,750 RPM and 7,250 RPM. Range 2 is anything above 7,250. Now, there are a couple of important things to note. One is that these ignitions are anytime the spark plug ignites. In the case of a 6-cylinder engine, for every rotation of the crankshaft, it will light up 3 spark plugs. The other thing to note with the 996 turbo is that its engine is Metzger based, which means it's designed to rev much higher than these RPMs located here. And that's what we'll get to when we get to the 997.1 GT3. And now it's time to break down exactly what this report means. We're going to start with range 1. The number in this car's case is 12,127, which might seem very high. But this isn't a reference to the number of times the car has been over the red line. It's a reference to the number of times the spark plug has lit up in this particular RPM range. The same thing is true with the ignitions in range number 2. It just references the number of times a spark plug has lit up, which is a true microscopic period of time over 7,250 RPM. But we can take these numbers and actually break them down into the amount of time that the engine has spent within that particular RPM range. And we're going to do exactly that by doing some math. So the formula for this is that you take the total number of ignitions, in this case 12,127, and then you'll divide that number by 3. The reason we do this is because this references the number of ignitions that occur per rotation of the crankshaft. Remember, we have to think in terms of RPM, revolutions per minute, because that is going to be our denominator. So in the case of the 996 Turbo, red line on this car is 6,750 RPM. And so we're going to take this entire number over 6,750. And because I'm certainly not a genius, I've done it on my phone, this number is 0.59, which represents the number of minutes that this car has spent within that RPM range. Multiply that by 60, and that will give you the number of seconds. In this case, this is 35.93 seconds that the car has spent within this RPM range. And again, that's in reference to the total number of hours that this car has been driven. So over its life, it's been up to redline for a grand total of 35.93 seconds. Not a lot of time over 2,852.8 operating hours. But let's do the exact same thing for the range 2 ignitions. So we'll take 574 divided by 3 all over 6,750. That number comes to 0.028, which is the equivalent of 1.7 seconds that the car has spent over red line. Now, that is not a long period of time for an engine like this. As I mentioned, this engine is designed to rev way higher than that. So this number, 1.7 seconds, that is not really a whole lot of time. That might be a couple of shifts in the car's lifetime that have spent, well, over that RPM range. But the thing to note with this specific instance is that it only occurred about 3 hours before the total number of operating hours that were put on this engine, meaning that this shift occurred relatively recently compared to when the DME report was done. If I were buying this car, it might be something I would ask about, but again, this number is pretty microscopic. 1.7 seconds total over the period of the car, so really, that might be one shift recently that the car was anywhere close to that. But it's also important to keep in mind this is a turbo model. The turbos are unique because as they build boost, that boost may continue to push the RPMs all the way through the red line. So you might see turbos with a higher number of ignitions in this particular range. Additionally, if you see that this number is really high, or even that the range ones are maxed out, well, that probably means that the car has a tune that pushes even more boost that carries the car into these RPM ranges much more easily. If you see this number at 65,536, that means that the car has been shifted around redline or maybe slightly above it, meaning that somebody has carried maybe a little bit of boost into that area with some frequency. It's very easy to do with turbos, and again, the engines are very strong, so it's not necessarily concerning to see that number maxed out. It also might be indicative that the 996 you're looking at has a tune. A lot of 996s got tunes in their time, and that meant that more boost was pushing the cars into this RPM range, thus maxing it out. It's also not uncommon to see them in this range, as again, more boost means you're having more ignitions at higher RPMs. And that's pretty common with 996 turbos. But this car in general looks pretty healthy. Again, I might ask what happened within the last 3 hours that it was driven, but again, not a huge deal, as it only has spent 1.7 seconds within that RPM range. Now it's time to talk about one of my favorite Metzger powered cars of all time, and that is the 997.1 GT3. This one specifically that sold on Cars and Bids a little while ago. And conveniently, this car came with a DME reading, and here it is in whiteboard form. So let's break it down a little bit. Initially looking at this report looks really good. You might think, wow, there's nothing in range 3 through 6. This is really clean. However, 997 GT3s are very specific. Unlike the 996 Turbo we looked at, their ranges begin at over 9,000 and between 9,000 and 9,200 RPM, well over the car's 8,400 RPM redline. And so, as I mentioned, the ranges begin between 9,000 and 9,200 and go up in 200 RPM increments from there. So anytime you see numbers on a 997.1 GT3's DME report, well, that means that it has been over redline. However, it's not that big of a deal again, as long as you're not seeing tons of ignitions in these upper RPM bounds. And it gets even more promising with this specific car. As you can see, it has 653.6 operating hours on this engine. Pretty good for a 997.1 GT3. And these ignitions occurred at 63.6 operating hours, almost 600 hours ago. So this car has been driven a ton since whatever this was occurred. So really, this is a good sign for this car. Ultimately, it means that it's been operating for a long time without issues since whatever happened here occurred. So really, this is a pretty good report. But let's break it down anyway, just so we can see exactly how much time it spent in ignition range 1 and ignition range 2. And so we'll take this number, 208 divided by 3, all over 8,400. And that, I'm going to use my calculator for, gives us 0.008 minutes that it has spent within that RPM range, or multiplied by 60 gives us 0.495 seconds that the car has spent between 9,000 and 9,200 RPM. That's barely a blink of an eye. It's like from now to now, or from now to now. It's such a small period of time. That seems like that was probably one shift, to be totally honest with you. And the same thing with this number here, 60 divided by 3, all over 8,400, is 0.002 or 0.14 seconds. A truly tiny amount of time that this car has spent within these RPM ranges. And so if you're looking at this car, just in reference to everything, looks like a pretty clean DME reading for this one. Really, both of these cars have pretty clean DME reports. But this is what you can expect to go through, and you have to really do your research and see, okay, what do each of these ranges mean specific to the car that I'm looking at, and when did they occur in reference to how many operating hours are on the engine. I will add, as a little aside, that I have seen some oddities pop up on these DME reports. Sometimes I'll see indications in these ranges and then just see one indication in all of those much higher ranges. These you can basically just ignore. It would be really difficult to have just one ignition in these ranges. That really doesn't happen. An Over Rev in this car might have much larger numbers. You might have 58 here, 60, 24 here, something like that, going down over time. But nonetheless, just to have one here would be really unusual. Occasionally that happens, and really you can chalk that up to the computer just having a bad day whenever that happened. If it just says 1, or occasionally maybe it might say 555 or something like that, it would be very rare for that to occur. But occasionally I have seen that, but what you really want to take into account are larger numbers that you have seen occur in these specific ranges. And the third thing that you have to know with DME reports is that they are one tool. They're not the end-all, be-all when it comes to determining the condition of your Porsche. Yes, they might tell you how the car was driven, or at least the last time it was driven hard, but what they won't tell you is a lot of other information about the condition of the car. If you really want to get the full scope of knowledge on a car's engine, well, you really have to have a compression test on it. You have to have a mechanic put a camera in each of the cylinder bores to see if there's any scoring on them. Things like that will give you a substantially more complete picture than just looking at the DME report. But of course, it's a relatively inexpensive and very useful tool to have. But do your due diligence. Look at the pictures of the car, listen to the videos, ask the seller questions, look at the service documentation. All of these things will really help you determine the condition of your Porsche. But the DME report is certainly useful, especially since you now know how to read it. And that is how you read a Porsche DME report. As I said, this is not the end-all, be-all with these cars, but it is a useful tool in determining exactly how your Porsche was driven by the previous owner. And if you've been in the market for a Porsche, well, of course, you can head to Cars and Bids to check out our wide selection. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will talk to you very soon. Goodbye.